The tragedy of Gene Markey's life when he married Hedy Lamarr. In 1939, Hollywood had already seen everything. It had seen scandals that destroyed careers overnight. It had seen marriages that lasted 3 weeks and divorces that lasted 3 years. It had seen women so beautiful that men signed contracts they hadn't read, and men so powerful that women signed contracts they hadn't read. And the whole machine kept turning because nobody involved could afford to look away long enough to ask what they were actually agreeing to. And then, Hedy Lamarr walked in. Not walked in the way beautiful women walk into rooms, walked in the way a weather system arrives. The kind where the temperature drops 2 degrees before you've registered the clouds, and by the time you think to bring a coat, you're already standing in it. She was 24 years old. She had been in America for less than 2 years. She spoke English with an accent that reviewers called continental and exotic, because they didn't have the language for what it actually was, which was the voice of someone who had already survived more than everyone else in that room combined, and had decided not to mention it. Every man who saw her wanted to be the one who understood her. Every man who got close enough to try ended up standing in a courtroom, or on a warship in the Pacific, or in a quiet room somewhere rearranging the story of what had happened to him into something he could live with. Gene Markey was a screenwriter, talented, respected, the kind of man Hollywood genuinely liked. He had already been married once, to Joan Bennett, a serious actress and a serious woman. He was not naive. He was not impulsive by nature. He met Hedy Lamarr at a party in late 1938 and married her 30 days later, and then spent the next 40 years of his life never mentioning her name in public again. That silence is where this story begins. Not with Gene Markey, with the woman who made him go quiet. Hedy Lamarr. The world has finally learned to credit her for the signals that connect us, the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the invisible architecture of the digital age. They call her an inventor now, because a patent is a technical solution, and the world loves a solution. But this story isn't about the technology she gave us. Everyone knows the genius. This video is about the tragedy, the truth of a woman who survived the world by making sure it never truly knew her. The girl from Vienna who learned to listen. Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler was born in Vienna in 1914 into a Jewish family comfortable enough to believe that intelligence was the most important thing you could give a child. Her father, Emil, believed it so completely that he spent her childhood explaining the world to her on long walks through the city. How engines worked, how signals traveled, how systems held together and fell apart. He spoke to her like her understanding mattered, like the mind behind the face was the point. She absorbed everything, and she never forgot anything. That detail matters more than any other fact in this story. By 18, she had landed the lead in a Czech film called Ecstasy, the first mainstream picture to depict a woman's sexual on screen. Pope Pius XI condemned it. The Nazi regime banned it. America blocked it, and the third wealthiest man in Austria saw it and immediately began pursuing its star with the focused energy of someone who needed to own a thing precisely because other people had already seen it. Fritz Mandl was 33. She was 18. She married him in August 1933 and entered what she would later call a golden cage. He banned her from acting. He had servants monitor her conversations. He dressed her in couture, seated her at the finest tables in Europe, and displayed her as the centerpiece of his collection, while signing arms contracts with Mussolini and the Austrian fascist movement, and spending a small fortune trying to locate and destroy every existing print of ecstasy. He could not erase what lived in other people's memories. That failure may have been the first thing Hedy ever found genuinely funny about him. But here is what Fritz Mandl never understood. He brought her to his business meetings, not as a participant, as furniture. A beautiful wife communicated power to clients. So, Hedy sat at dinners and conferences where the conversation covered torpedo guidance systems, radio jamming frequencies, and the vulnerabilities of remote-controlled weaponry. She wore silk. She said little. She looked exactly as decorative as he needed her to look. She was memorizing every word. She cross-referenced what she heard with what her father had taught her on those walks. She built, in complete silence, across 4 years, an understanding of military technology assembled from conversations held by men who had collectively decided she wasn't paying attention. Fritz Mandel had tried to lock up the most dangerous thing about Hedy Lamarr. He had locked up the wrong thing. In 1935, her father died. She wore black for a year. Then, something clarified. She started planning her escape, and in the third attempt, she made it. Paris, then London. With enough jewelry to survive and a mind full of things nobody knew she had learned. She was 23 years old, and she had already understood something that would define every relationship she had for the rest of her life. The most effective kind of power is the kind the person across from you never recognizes as power at all. The Normandy, Louis B. Mayer, and One Calculated Crossing. London, September 1937. Louis B. Mayer, the most powerful man in Hollywood, was in the city recruiting talent. He met Hedwig Kiesler, noted the ecstasy controversy, and offered her $125 a week. She said no. Then she found out he was sailing back to New York on the Normandy and bought a ticket on the same ship. 5 days on the Atlantic. One person she needed to convince. She had done more with less. She didn't seduce him. She was simply interesting, precise, attentive in the way that makes the person being listened to feel genuinely seen. By the time the ship docked in New York, Mayer had offered her a 7-year contract at $500 a week and a new name, Hedy Lamarr, borrowed from a silent film star who had burned brilliantly and died at 29. Nobody noted the echo in the name. Hedy accepted it and went to work. Algiers opened in 1938 and turned her into a phenomenon overnight. Women across America dyed their hair dark brown. MGM saw a face that sold tickets and cast her accordingly. Beautiful, exotic, largely passive. She accepted every role without complaint, showed up on time, and spent her breaks in her trailer working on inventions with a miniature lab kit Howard Hughes had given her. When she told Hughes his airplane wings were aerodynamically wrong, he brought her to his factory. She redesigned the wing profile from her own study of birds and fish. His engineers confirmed it worked. He called her a genius. She already knew. In 1942, she and composer George Antheil filed a patent for a frequency-hopping torpedo guidance system, a signal that jumped between 88 frequencies in synchronized random patterns, nearly impossible to jam. The U.S. Navy rejected it. A movie actress and a modernist composer had no business telling the military how to fight a war. Someone suggested she go sell war bonds instead. She went. 10 days, 16 cities, $17 million raised. No visible bitterness, no public statement. She had learned in Mandel's house how to absorb a dismissal without letting the other person see it land. After those 10 days, something in Hedy Lamarr closed permanently. The part of her that had needed to be seen correctly, recognized for what she actually was, went quiet. Not healed, quiet. The way a lock sounds when it finally clicks shut. And with that door closed, she turned her full attention to the one arena where her particular set of skills had always worked without complication. Men. Gene Markey, the boy named James, and the architecture of a secret. This is where Gene Markey enters the story, not as its center, as its context. He appeared in late 1938, screenwriter, respected, genuinely good in the way that some people are genuinely good, without effort or performance. He had been married before, to Joan Bennett, and the marriage had ended cleanly, without scandal, which said something about the kind of man he was. He met Hedy at a party, and she allowed him to believe he was pursuing her. They were married on March 4th, 1939, in Mexico. 3 witnesses. She was back on set the following morning. In October 1939, they announced the adoption of a baby boy. They named him James Lamar Markey. Gene signed the papers, gave the child his surname, and loved the boy with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who had decided this was his son. What Gene did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that James was not an adopted child. James was Hedy Lamarr's biological son. His father was the British actor John Loder, with whom Hedy had been involved in secret while Loder was still married to his first wife. A pregnancy made public in 1939 would have ended her MGM contract, destroyed the image she had spent 2 years constructing in America, and confirmed every suspicion about the woman who had starred in Ecstasy at 18. She managed it the way she managed everything, quietly, precisely, without asking anyone's permission. She gave birth in secret. She constructed the legal fiction of an adoption, with Gene Markey's name on the paperwork as the boy's legal father. Gene believed the story entirely and loved the child completely. John Loder, the biological father, remained in Hedy's life. 4 years after the marriage to Gene, she married Loder. And at that point, Loder formally adopted James, his own biological son, in a legal ceremony that neither man fully understood. Gene Markey had signed his name as the legal father of his wife's secret child by another man. John Loder had later signed his name as the adoptive father of his own biological son. And James had entered a life built on a foundation that would not reveal itself for 61 years. The marriage between Gene and Hedy lasted 18 months on paper. Court records from the divorce proceedings documented that during those 18 months, the couple had shared the same physical space on 4 nights. When Gene enlisted in the Navy and shipped out to the Pacific, Hedy filed for divorce while he was at sea. She cited irreconcilable differences. 3 words. Filed while her husband was on a warship thousands of miles away, at a moment when he had no ability to respond or even ask why. She did not write a letter. She did not wait for him to come home. She was simply finished, and she processed the paperwork accordingly. Gene Markey returned from the war. He married Myrna Loy. He rebuilt his life into something warm and quiet and real. In every interview, every profile, every public conversation for the next 4 decades, he talked about Joan Bennett, about Myrna Loy, about the films and the war and the friendships. He never once said Hedy Lamarr's name. That is Gene Markey's chapter. Brief by her standards. He was one of 6. 5 more men, and the same story, with different names. John Loder became husband number 3 in 1943. He and Hedy had 2 more children, Denise in 1945, Anthony in 1947. By the time Anthony was 4 months old, she had initiated divorce proceedings. In court, she described Loder as emotionally absent, indifferent to his family, and unsuited to marriage. Loder told a reporter afterward, "It's pretty tough being Mr. Hedy Lamarr." Teddy Stouffer lasted 9 months in 1951. A German band leader and nightclub owner who seemed glamorous against the backdrop of a Mexican vacation, and turned out to be, in Hedy's court testimony, physically violent. Divorce granted. Howard Lee, a Texas oil tycoon, became husband number 5 in December 1953 and lasted 6 years, the longest of any of her marriages. Hedy moved to Houston, stopped filming, and remodeled their mansion obsessively, room by room, as though the right configuration of spaces might finally produce the stability that no person had yet been able to give her. The marriage ended in 1960, with both parties filing competing accusations of cruelty. Both claimed to be the victim. Reading the documents today, it is genuinely impossible to determine who was telling the truth, which may itself be the most accurate record of what actually happened between them. Louis Boys Jr. was her divorce attorney during the separation from Howard Lee. She married him in March 1963. He was the sixth husband and the last. 2 years later, she divorced him, claiming he had taken approximately $500,000 of her money and subjected her to cruelty both in private and in public. 6 marriages, 6 divorces. Not one of them ended without formal legal accusations filed in a court of record. In every case, she walked away and began again. The men did not know about each other's experiences in any detail. There was no warning available to receive. The only consistent element across all 6 was Hedy Lamarr herself, moving through each chapter with the same pattern, the same precision, and the same apparent inability to recognize that what was happening to the people around her was happening because of her. Not cruelty in the way we usually mean the word, something quieter and in some ways more difficult to defend against. The genuine, complete failure to experience other people as fully real. They were useful or they were not. They were present or they were replaceable. And when they became the latter, she processed the paperwork and moved on without visible distress. James, the birth certificate, and 61 years. James grew up believing he had been discarded. He struggled at school, the behavior of a child who has absorbed, without being told in words, that he occupies a position of lesser importance than he was supposed to. By the time he was 11, Hedy had arranged for him to live permanently with his teacher's family. He wrote letters to his mother that were returned to him unopened. "She didn't want anything more to do with me," he said later. "I was angry, and then I just accepted it." He accepted the explanation that made the most sense from the outside, that he was an adopted child who had not worked out, and that the woman who had taken him in had decided he was more than she was able to manage. It was a painful story. It was also not the true one. When Hedy died in January 2000, her will divided an estate of approximately $3.3 million between Denise and Anthony. James was not mentioned, not reduced, not addressed. Simply absent from the final legal document she left behind, as completely as though he had never been part of her life. In 2001, 1 year after her death, James found his original birth certificate. He was not adopted. He was Hedy Lamarr's biological son. His father was John Loder, the man who had become Hedy's third husband, who had formally adopted James at 4 years old, who had raised him for years while not knowing he was raising his own child. James had spent 61 years living with the question of why he had been thrown away. The answer, when it finally arrived, was that he had not been thrown away by a woman who didn't want an adopted child. He had been hidden and then discarded by a woman who didn't want evidence, a woman who had used a good man's trust and a legal document to conceal an inconvenient truth, and who had, when the child himself became inconvenient, removed him from the narrative with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else. There is no version of that discovery that lands as relief. Some truths do not set people free. They simply replace one unbearable story with another. The face in the mirror. In the late 1950s, Hedy Lamarr began having plastic surgery. She had always known what her face was worth, not metaphorically, but in the specific transactional sense of someone who had used it as currency in every significant negotiation of her adult life. It had gotten her through MGM's gates. It had given her the patience of studio executives who might otherwise have dismissed her. It had bought her the freedom to invent in her trailer while the industry thought she was resting between takes. When age began to change it, she responded the way she responded to every problem, with direct action and without sentiment. She found surgeons. She had procedures. She treated the situation as a technical problem with a technical solution. But surgery does not respond to intelligence or force of will. Repeated procedures over years alter the underlying architecture of a face in ways that accumulate quietly and then, suddenly, cannot be reversed. By the late 1960s, people who had known her for decades struggled to recognize her in person. By the 1970s, she had stopped appearing in photographs. By the 1980s, she had withdrawn from public life entirely and was living in a modest house in Castleberry, Florida. She communicated exclusively by telephone, sometimes 6 or 7 hours a day, talking to friends, acquaintances, people who had somehow obtained her number. She would not meet anyone in person, not old friends, not journalists, not Denise, not Anthony. The explanation she gave, on the rare occasions she addressed it, was her appearance. She did not want to be seen as anything other than what she had been. That much was true, but underneath the explanation was something harder to name. The possibility that Hedy Lamarr had organized her entire interior life around the experience of being perceived as the most beautiful woman in the room, and that when that perception became unavailable to her, she found there was no self beneath it she trusted anyone else to see. Not because she lacked depth. She had more depth than almost anyone she had ever worked alongside. But the world had told her from the age of 14 onward that the depth didn't count. And somewhere across 80 years, she had believed it enough to stop insisting otherwise. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation awarded her the Pioneer Award for the frequency-hopping spread spectrum technology she had patented in 1942. The patent had long since expired, meaning she received no financial compensation for the invention that had become the foundational principle behind Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and GPS, technologies running through every device on Earth at the moment this sentence is being heard. She declined to attend the ceremony. She sent Anthony in her place. He stood at the podium holding a magazine from the 1940s, her photograph on the cover, her face as it had been at 27, and played a recording of her voice. "I'm happy that this invention has been so successful. I appreciate your acknowledgement. It was not done in vain." The audience applauded the recording. Anthony accepted the award. His mother stayed home, in Florida, alone, in a house where the telephone was the only connection she still maintained with a world that had once stopped every conversation she walked into. She died on January 19, 2000. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world for 30 years. She co-invented the technology that now connects billions of people to one another every day, and she was never compensated for it. And she was too proud and too wounded and too sealed off behind a door that had been locked from the inside to stand in a room and let anyone see what had become of the face they were honoring. She survived Fritz Mandel. She survived the ecstasy scandal. She survived Hollywood's systematic refusal to see past her appearance, the Navy's systematic refusal to take her invention seriously, 6 marriages and 6 courtrooms, and the slow disintegration of the face that had been both her greatest asset and her deepest prison. She survived all of it. She was extraordinarily good at surviving. What she could not figure out, what no amount of intelligence or precision or patient, devastating self-control could solve, was the difference between surviving and being known. Between moving through the world with perfect, practiced competence and actually allowing another person to see you clearly, without calculation, without the arrangement of light and angle and carefully selected information. Gene Markey had tried to know her. So had Loder, and Lee, and Boys, and the others. James had wanted nothing more complicated than a mother who opened his letters. None of them got what they were reaching for. Not because Hedy Lamarr didn't have it to give, but because she had spent so long using every part of herself as a tool that she had forgotten, if she had ever known, what it felt like to simply exist in front of another person without a purpose behind it. That was the tragedy. Not Gene Markey's. His was real but temporary, the kind of wound that heals if you give it 40 years and a good marriage. The tragedy was Hedy Lamarr's, the most beautiful woman in the world, the mother of wireless technology, the girl from Vienna who had listened in the right rooms and remembered everything and never let anyone see her afraid. She died alone in a small house in Florida, with the curtains drawn, talking on the phone to people she would not allow to visit, in a face she would not let anyone see, having protected herself so completely and so expertly for so long that there was, in the end, no one left on either side of the wall. Not even her.